I'm curious to see what they're going to say about you guys on this one. The last moderator is going.
No, I hope. Hopefully no. Well, I didn't catch the point when you said about a video with someone who speaks, since it's something new. We didn't know that one.
Lip synchronization.
Welcome to the 2023 edition of Trieste Next. I'm Luca, an AI-generated speaker who will presenting our festival. In the next 3 days, we will be talking about a new world. This is the title of the 12th edition of our Festival of Science. Innovation and research, the ethical limits and new frontiers of science will be the center of all our events. What will the new world be like? Will we be able to face the challenges of the near future applying new scientific discoveries and technologies in a sustainable way? This will be the underlying theme of Trieste Next, with 100 events in English and Italian, the Science Book of the Year Literary Award, 300 speakers, 70 activities for schools and 40 exhibition spaces that are open for everybody in the city center close to the town hall. Before leaving the floor to our next panelists, I would like to thank all the scientific institutions within the Trieste City of Knowledge Network, the main partner together with our content partners and sponsors for supporting our project. Mostly, thank you to the 200 volunteers who are helping us. I have one last remark for all of you. The next event will last 75 minutes. Our speakers will answer all of your questions in the final 15 minutes. Also, please remember to check the updated schedule of events on our website. Thank you and enjoy our festival.
Okay, welcome everybody, and thank you very much for coming to this panel on robotic ecosystems. I am Eric Medvet. I'm an associate professor of computer engineering at the University of Trieste. I do research on evolutionary computation and evolutionary robotics. This is one of the reasons for which I'm one of the organizers of this panel. And I will chair this panel, this discussion, together with Professor Erica Salvato, who is an assistant professor in automation at the University of Trieste and lecturer of data-driven and learning-based control. So today we are going to debate about robots and ecosystems, or let's say more precisely about robotic ecosystems, trying to look beyond tomorrow, not just what we are doing today, but also try to keep a solid scientific point of view. For this reason, we have here two world-level experts on robotics who will be the main drivers of our discussion. Our first guest is Professor Ruth Aylett. She's a professor of computer science at the Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh, Scotland. She has worked in AI, in artificial intelligence and robotics for 35 years. She currently works on social agents and human-robot interaction, including long-lived robot companions, affective modeling, and expressive behavior. She is the co-author of the popular science book, Living with Robots, What Every Anxious Human Needs to Know, and as you can see, this title suggests that she is the perfect guest for this discussion.
So, our second guest is instead Gusz Eiben, Professor Gusz Eiben. He is professor in artificial intelligence at the Vrije Universiteit of Amsterdam and visiting professor at the University of York, UK. He is an expert in evolutionary computing and in evolutionary robotics. His main research concerns robots that can evolve and learn. He is the grandfather of the Robot Baby Project, a proof of concept to demonstrate that robots can reproduce. His long-term research objective is to employ artificial evolution to develop artificial intelligence and artificial life. So welcome both of you. And I think that we can start. And well, we are here to talk about robots, and in particular the idea that robots can create an ecosystem or that can be introduced in our ecosystem. I think that everyone in this room has at least an high-level idea of what a robot is. And I think also that the majority of us think that robot is something that is new. However, the idea of robots started very far. If we think about also the Asimov books, robots start the idea of something that can help the humanity in performing tasks. It's has a very long story. Now the robot had a very long evolution, and we have in every daily life some robots with us. For example, the robot vacuum cleaner, or also the robotic arms that helps in factories production. However, if we think about robots and the evolution of robots, we can grasp a very interesting thing, that is that in a certain sense it seems that we are trying to develop robot that imitates human, both in shape and in the action that we perform. And I think that it could be a very interesting starting point of our discussion. And I think...
yeah, that's an interesting observation, because not only we are building robots with these, physical machines which are somehow capable to perform similar behaviors to us, and which are similar to us in the shape as to us as humans and to us as animals, let's say, but we are also building disembodied agents, so things capable of doing things, in this case writing, okay, without having a body, but again in a way which is quite similar to how we behave. Here we can see a snapshot, a screenshot of a dialogue we are having with a chatbot. And chatbots are now very strong, now very capable of showing a behavior which is very similar to our behaviors. They, let's say, somehow write, or they write the same things we write upon a proper prompt. So summarizing, we are building both embodied machines and disembodied machines, let's say agents, we are, that are in a larger and larger number, more and more complex, and still similar to us, humans and living things. Are we so building a sort of ecosystem, a society, more than, let's say, a set of automatic agents, or not? This could be the starting point of the discussion, but even before this, do you, panelists, our guests, do you agree with this vision? Do you think that we are actually building more and more robots which are more and more complex and more similar to us? This will be the first question. I will start with Professor Aylett.
Well, I like to be realistic. In my own life, I bridge the arts and sciences. I'm a writer and a poet as well as being an engineer. And in arts, metaphor is one of our primary tools. It engages the imagination and the emotions. In engineering, when metaphor comes in the door, good engineering goes out the window. And I would caution you, because a lot of this discussion depends on metaphor. From my perspective, a robot is an engineered artifact. Washing machines are also engineered artifacts. Why do we feel differently about robots? Because as humans, we are hardwired to look for human-like behavior. It's been a survival characteristic. We infer purpose in things around us. We want to know what they're going to do. They might be going to eat us, or they might have been a few thousand years ago. Everything around us has spirits, or did have, the spirits of the thunder, the gods of the springs, because that's a human characteristic. Be very wary about this. These are metaphors, they're not actual engineering facts. In engineering fact, robotics is very difficult. The capabilities of robots are currently still rather primitive, and they require well-engineered niches in which to function reliably. Now, that's not the robot of the imagination, and it's not the robot that you see in films, but it's engineering robotics. And I urge you to think carefully when you hear stuff about robots to decide whether what you're hearing is the metaphor, the imagination, or the actual engineered artifacts we can produce now and in the next, say, 50 years. It's a very difficult area in which to build capable machinery, very difficult indeed. And robots currently are less capable in general than very primitive living things. So I don't know if you know slugs, little things that eat your cabbages, little squishy things like snails without shells. In my view, robots are less capable than slugs in general. Slugs live very well, there are millions of them. They can creep up through your waste pipe and eat the plants on your windowsill in your kitchen, believe me, I know. They don't need people, they can look after themselves, they can propagate all over the earth and eat your cabbages. Robots do not have these capabilities, and trying to produce those capabilities is inherently difficult and may not be feasible with our current technology. It's a moot point, a snarkable point. So I know this is pouring buckets of cold water over a lot of discussion of robotics, but that's my role in life, is to put sufficient cold water over the topic for people to think clearly about the topic and think about what we've got and where we're going realistically, and not in terms of metaphors or the imagination.
Okay, thank you. Professor Eiben, what's your opinion on this?
The answer to your question is yes. And I don't think everybody remembers the question, but the question was, are we really building more and more complex robots that are more and more human-like, and maybe they will become an ecosystem? But I want to add two things to it. I think it's much more exciting to compare robots not to humans only, but to animals in general, because there are much more different kinds of animals, you know, their morphology, their shapes, their behaviors, their interactions. There's a much larger diversity in animals than in humans only. So that makes the picture more interesting. There is more to investigate, more to understand, and more to rely on if you want to allow some metaphors or inspirations from nature, so to say. The second thing about engineering, I completely agree that engineering robots is a very hard thing, but I see a very, very bright light at the end of the tunnel, and that's what I call second-order engineering. So good old engineering is that a human expert sits down and produces a machine he or she wants to have. You know, a steam engine, a washing machine, a robot that is vacuum cleaning your living room. Second-order engineering is the kind of generative AI, hardly dare to say, or evolutionary computing that we are both very active in, where you first design and build a system that designs and builds the robot for you. And that's why it is second order. We don't directly engineer the object we want to have, but we develop a method that will develop that thing for us. In particular, learning and evolution are very powerful tools for this. If you think of the most powerful or the best designer in the universe we know of, it must be evolution, because it has designed, you know, the diversity of all living beings on Earth. You know, the pouch of a kangaroo, you know, the eye of a spider, the neck of a giraffe, the brain of a human. It's all the product of evolution. So if we only could somehow tame that and put it in our advantage, we would benefit big time from products that are the same ingenious and diverse and amazing.
Okay, thank you both. So I think, let's say, we more or less agree on the fact that there is a path towards having more and more robots, more and more complex robots. We don't know exactly how to get there. We think maybe that evolution could be one way to get there. More broadly, let's say, the capability to adapt to some evolutionary pressure, so to some selection, okay, that could be a way to get to a bunch of more complex robots than what we have now. So now the question is, will these bunch of complex robots be an ecosystem? What is an ecosystem? What could be a robotic ecosystem? And this is the next question for you. Professor Aylett?
So again, I'm cautious. I think ecosystem is being used here as a metaphor. What we can do is to build robots with a degree of intercooperation. But the fundamental basis for an ecosystem is sustainability, self-sustainability. So robots require power. As I said, they're pieces of machinery. The power requirements of robots are very rarely discussed because they're not glamorous at all. But most robots will run for a matter of hours if they have to move around quite a bit before their battery fails. You can put robots on an electric surface, but clearly you're not going to put humans on an electric surface. Although battery technology is improving under the impetus of mobile phones and to some extent the drive to build autonomous cars with all its problems, nevertheless the technology is limited. So I think the first requirement for any kind of ecosystem is that you would need things that were self-powering. Broadly, battery technology is a problem because its energy density, and by this I mean how much energy you get from the weight of the battery, is not that good. You get much more energy from chemical things. That's how we run. Okay, so we last more than a few hours on our breakfast because we're using chemical energy, which powers us much more efficiently than a battery does. Although we are generating electricity as well in the body, but we're doing it from chemical power. Chemical power so far has meant internal combustion engines, but you don't run those indoors. So the most successful robots for long-term operation use internal combustion engines up to now, because they're quite long-lasting, and the energy density of oil, it's one of our problems, of course, is much higher than that of batteries. So I would say the first requirement for an ecosystem is for us to understand how to produce a self-sustaining robot from a power point of view, and we're some way from doing this. Some people I knew tried to do this. They produced back to slugs. They thought, we'll put a robot in a cabbage field to catch slugs. It'll catch the slugs and it will drop them into a biomass converter, and that will generate some electricity, and then the robot can recharge its battery. That was the vision, if you like. Now, this project worked very hard. They didn't succeed, partly because catching slugs is very difficult. They needed big wheels because it's muddy. They needed a great big long arm. How do you recognize a slug in the dark? They found picking up a slug was tricky because they're slippery. It would go whoop, like that. Then it stuck when they wanted to drop it into... Yeah, this is engineering. All kinds of frustrating things happen when you're working with robots, let me tell you. But that was a conception of making a robot self-sustaining, that it would be able to autonomously gain enough energy from its environment to recharge its own batteries. And for me, that's a fundamental requirement if we want something that's actually an ecosystem, because that's what you see in nature.
Yeah, so let me add something to this. I'm more optimistic. I mean, you're completely right, but sound a bit pessimistic. So let me just make a more optimistic note. One thing I learned from biologists, whom I talk to a lot about evolution, is that the environment always is really very important. It determines the optimal life form or robotic system. And that means that there might be, and there is a big distinction, a difference between where the robots operate. So if you want robots operate in a living room, then energy is not a problem because we have power points, how do you call it, outlets. If you want robots for an urban environment, that is not so much of a problem either, because in an urban environment there are lots of sources of energy. Robots in the jungle to monitor the climate change, that's a bigger challenge, or there are different regions on Earth where you have to solve it in a different way. But once again, in certain environments, energy, self-sustaining robot colonies that run on an energy run longer than one battery charge can be quite easily solved. Think of your Roomba in your own living room.
Okay. So if I'm correctly understanding, you have a quite similar idea, but in different sense. So
yep.
In a certain sense, there is a big problem in order to create an engineering ecosystem of robots, since we are saying that is a metaphor, of course. It's something that we are creating by ourselves. So it's an engineering ecosystem. But one of you said that one problem could be the energy power. Another said that the problem could be the environment, the fact that the robot should be adaptable to the environment in which he has to operate. So in this point of view, what should be the other steps, the technical steps, in order to create this engineering robotic ecosystem to make it able to work in our life and help us in performing some tasks, for example?
I 100% agree with Gusz about the environment. I think that's a very significant point. And as I've said, robots can work well in well-designed environments. environments which can support their limitations. So it's a mistake to say, oh, robots are no good, they can't do anything. That's not true, but they can't do what people imagine. They can work very well within particular environments where the limitations of our engineering can be sustained and where, to some extent, human intervention may also be able to help. So yes, the Roomba can self-charge in your living room, okay? It's not a particularly good part of the domestic ecosystem, mainly because it's not very intelligent. So a notorious robot vacuum cleaner problem is where it runs over the stuff that pets should not leave on the carpet but sometimes do, and spreads it all around the flat. Okay, this has happened a lot of times. It's actually recognised by the manufacturers who are now trying to design something that will recognise it before the thing runs over the top of it. Okay, as I said, these are engineering issues. Now that's a relatively benign environment, and even so, there are still things to think about in that environment. Also, people don't like the noise, they'd rather run these things at night, and also you don't want the thing hoovering over your feet when you're trying to drink coffee with your friends. So this is a social environment, in other words. So I think we have to think carefully about the environments we want to put robots into. So something like search and rescue is perhaps a better environment because there's a very clear purpose. It doesn't matter if robots get crushed nearly as much as it does if people get crushed. Planetary environments, again, they're not good environments for humans. Subsea environments, environments where humans are in peril and find it very difficult to operate, are better environments for robots because they don't suffer the same risks. So I would focus more on those sorts of environments, and I think there we can make good progress providing we're realistic about what we want the robots to do and how we want them to do it and what the constraints of those environments actually are. And then they can perform very useful purposes, I think.
Yes, and just right up on that, I think it would really help big time if we gave up the concept that the robots must be humanoid. Okay, if you say robot, everybody thinks of a humanoid, but that's not necessarily true. So it's maybe ironic, but the most popular robotic life form may be the vacuum cleaner, which for me illustrates a beautiful point. The optimal robot design is always depending on the environment and the task. They are not tall, so that they fit under the couch, and they are round without sharp edges, so that they don't destroy your wall if they run into it. Okay, so for that environment, that task, that's a perfect life for a robotic form. And if we make this a very, kind of principal point, starting point, then it will be also much easier to come up with the solutions for all those different tasks and environments and environments that we have in mind.
I think that's an excellent point. You could compare robot vacuum cleaners to social insects, for instance. Little things that you don't interact with that just go about their own business in an impervious sort of a way. Yes. Other animals, one of the problems with human-like robots is bipedal locomotion, an unsolved problem. It's still not particularly safe around people, which is why you don't see them around. If one of those falls on you, you'd notice. So wheels work better. But if you've got 4 legs, it's different. You have a much more stable thing. But you've got something that's more like a dog or a cat or something like that, a 4-legged animal, and people will tend to interact with it in that sort of a way. It doesn't need to have lots of human-like capabilities for it to provide a useful service and to interact in a sensible way with people, because we know how to interact with that kind of thing. So I think Gus's point about not getting hung up on humanoid robots is an excellent point. But the power of metaphor being what it is, people do go humanoid when they think of robots. That's the metaphor. That's the point I was trying to make earlier.
Think of the Robo Cup, the robot football or soccer competition every year. And it has different leagues. And one of the humanoid leagues, so there you see now robots playing football, that's, I would say, the conservative approach. You want a robot look like Messi, with a torso, 2 legs, head, eyes. But then there are robots that have 4 legs or 4 feet. That's a broader-minded team, They think, playing football on 4 feet may be better than playing football on 2 feet. And there are the radicalists in the league where you don't even have feet. They are little carts on wheels, kicking around the ball somehow. So same task, same environment, and radically different approaches in morphology and behavior.
And those are the ones that play something that's entertainingly like football.
Exactly.
Actually.
Yes.
So the little round pucks can whiz a ball around like nobody's business, very, very fast. The four-legged ones tend to get the ball stuck underneath them, which is unfortunate. The two-legged ones are very slow, indeed, like this. And kicking the ball without falling over is definitely an issue, particularly if you have bigger ones. But the usual ones are about that high. Yeah. So, you can do wonderful things if you don't get hung up on the metaphor.
Okay, thank you both. So I agree with you on the fact that if you give too much space, let's say, to the metaphor, then there is little space for the engineering side, let's say, of the thing. Up to now, we are discussing about robots with a purpose. Robots that can play soccer, robots that can clean, robots that can, let's say, perform rescue. Now, suppose, and so we are more about engineering, okay? Now, suppose that we are not building robots with a purpose, but we are just building robots that have the ability to survive, to proliferate, to, let's say, reproduce, becoming larger and larger numbers. So the first question is, I will have two questions, and there will be two questions on this. The second one is the technical feasibility, but first, is this path, so I repeat, the idea of building machines that just have the ability to reproduce, to become more and more, is this path a path that we as humans want, or let's say, tolerate to go on, or not? Ruth?
Well, it's an entertaining speculation, and I know people research it, I know Gusz does. Yes, it clearly has its problems, not least because I doubt myself whether the current morphology and powering of robots, that's what I call the paradigm of metal, gears, batteries, is ever going to really sustain reproduction. Because of the physical complexity. I know people are trying to tackle it, but it's never going to be very easy. Because behind a robot made of metal are factories in a huge pyramid, if you think about it. Where did the metal come from? Someone had to mine it. Where did the other raw materials come from? What about the components? They also have to be constructed. There are factories that turn out batteries. Think of cars. There's a whole car assembly at the top, and then a huge pyramid of car manufacture underneath. And that's characteristic of complex pieces of machinery. So I'm not convinced that that's a good paradigm. Biology is much simpler. Yeah? Put two rabbits in a hutch of opposite sexes with some lettuce, and you will end up probably with a lot more rabbits quite quickly. They don't need factories. Bioengineered robots, I think we could probably crack the problem, but we might call those viruses, mightn't we? So whether that's such a good idea, I'm rather uncertain.
Okay, I give two answers. I understand that we will get a second question about how to get there. So just let's assume that we are there. And what would be that good for? So I have two answers. One is, say, the scientific answer. So this scientific method for hundreds of years partly relies on using models. If you want to understand the phenomenon, you make a model of it. It could be a mathematical model in a couple of formulas, or a simulation inside a computer, a software model. And robots, these robots that we are talking about, they would represent a hardware model of evolution. So we do have software models of evolution. Computational biology is a thing. And there are biologists who study questions about the evolution of X in software simulations. Software simulations have a big problem, the reality gap. Okay? So in software, they always make an approximation of reality. And your model may represent a lot of things that are, here. Your model may have light and dark. It may have hard and soft. It may have gravity. It may have friction. And it may not have temperature. So whatever temperature does to a real robot, you will miss it. When you do it in a hardware model, you don't have to bother about it. So your model may not be biologically plausible, but it will be physically plausible. So robots as a hardware model of evolution can help us understand evolution better and our own origin and our own evolution. The second point is more practical, is the engineering. And I don't always like to contrast science to engineering, but it can be helpful. So if we had an evolving robot system, then we could just exploit what evolution can do, always give you better and better solutions by simply adapting to the environments and the circumstances, requirements, the resources there. And we know that also artificial evolution, evolutionary computing, can and does give you solutions that a human designer would never think of, but they are practically much better, measurably better in efficiency, efficacy, than whatever human experts can come up with. So yes, it would help us in science, understanding evolution, and it will help us engineering. It could give us solutions we couldn't create, and it could produce it on locations we cannot go, other planets, deep seas, cave systems.
Okay, thank you both. Before going to the next point, which is technical feasibility or robotic reproduction, I would like to elaborate more on this idea of, let's say, evolution of an artificial thing. Think about, for example, the large language models. Basically, what is happening is that starting from the first one of them, humans are modifying them, making them, let's say, usually better, but not always, okay? We modify them, we produce new large language models. The most successful ones could be successful in building natural language, successful in building code, successful in building technical documents, okay? The most successful ones are more and more used. They are more frequently deployed on computer systems, so basically they are somehow replicating. So this can be as a case in which we, the human society, humans are the substrate for the replication of an artificial things, large language models, chatbots. Another example of this is the one concerning cleaning robots. We started with a very stupid cleaning robot, then we produced another cleaning robot, observing it, trying to ameliorate it. We did many attempts, some of them are more successful, some are less successful, and we are selling robots, okay, so producing robots, hopefully the better one in larger numbers and the worse one in smaller number. But basically, again, we are a sort of substrate of a thing, an artificial thing, which is replicating. The user point of view is that we are the active part and the robot is the passive part. We are building robots and robots are just built. But from this point of view, robots are there and we as a substrate are, let's say, putting down the conditions according to which some of the robots replicate, let's say, increase in number and some other decrease in number. So it's something like what happens in nature with more successful species and less successful species. The most successful in that environment, let's say, increase in number, and here we observe the same thing. The best cleaning robots are more produced and sold in larger number. Okay, so this was just an idea of a different point of view of what could be reproduction and what could be, let's say, the origin of the idea of a robotic ecosystem. Basically, we humans, our society, are where a robotic ecosystem arises because we are the one building it. Okay, so it's like the terrain on which plants grow. We are a sort of terrain. Okay, we provide energy, we provide material, we build them, we allow them to build, and so on. I agree that this is a very, weird, let's say, point of view because I saying that we humans are the passive part and what is basically a thing, a robot is the active part. So I do agree if you say that it's not a good point of view, but okay. So now let's go to the next point, reproduction, robotic reproduction. So a robot able to reproduce itself. Is this thing feasible from a technical point of view? What are the milestones to get there? Gusz.
Yeah, so thank you for this question. I'm working on it for 15 years. Yes, it is possible. Yes, it has been demonstrated in very simple forms. And the basic idea, the basic trick to this is the trick that life on Earth uses to distinguish the code and the expression of that code. Biologists would say the genotype and the phenotype. In popular terms, the DNA and the animal itself, which could be you or the human being, okay? To understand this dichotomy, it also solves a lot of problems, because you can realize that reproduction, the recombination of parental genes, if we speak about a species that had sexual reproduction, okay? It was not your mother giving an arm and your father giving a leg. It was the DNA of your mother and the DNA of your father. The code was combined with each other, and then you got a new piece of code, and then you had the process of constructing the phenotype from the genotype, which in human beings takes 9 months. And in my lab in Amsterdam, it takes like anywhere between 5 to 12 hours. So the trick is, if only we can have the genetic code to represent and describe new robots, or a huge variety of huge robots, then recombination is okay, and mutation is even easier. Just change the description, and then you will have a robot with a different color or a leg instead of a wheel. So the problem becomes, can we have an artificial equivalent of the genotype-phenotype mapping process, okay? That takes 9 months in a human and, I don't know, 21 days in an egg of a chicken. Yes, it's possible. The simple answer is we can have 3D printers act as the womb or as the egg. Problem is, 3D printers of today, they cannot print a lot of things. They cannot print electronics, they cannot print a servo motor, they cannot print, a lot of things. But to some extent, we, roboticists, only have to wait, because development is really hard. And at a certain moment, there will be enough capable 3D printers so that we can do everything in one go. Until that, we have a combination of 3D printed components and prefabricated components like a Raspberry Pi to host the brain and assembly. So in the UK, there was a beautiful project which I was lucky to be part of. It was called the Autonomous ARE, Autonomous Robot Evolution Project, with participants from Edinburgh, York, Bristol, and from Amsterdam. And the dream was, which we almost realized, is build a machine that can produce robot babies without human hands in the loop. And it was demonstrated. Unfortunately, 18 months of the 4 years were COVID time, so nobody could go to the robot lab, which slowed us down big time. But the demonstrator is there. And it's crappy, and it's slow, but it is just like, compare the very first cars 120 years ago, and the Ferraris that I see here on the street. So the first example is there.
So I have to ask, who builds the 3D printers? Because if you need a 3D printer and you need the material for the 3D printer that's going to print with, those also have to come from somewhere. And that's what the rabbits don't need, in my view. Yeah? So I think what you're saying is, to a certain extent, we can automate the production of robots so that one can produce a robot in an automated fashion without human intervention in the process, but you still have to build the 3D printers. You still have to provide the materials for the 3D printers. That's not what living things do. Living things are a good deal more versatile than that. This is why I say I'm not convinced that the paradigm for robots will in fact allow us to do something that living things do. The reason living things can do what they do is because tissue can grow autonomously from DNA. We don't know quite how that happened. This is, as they say, the mystery of life. We still don't quite understand how this happened, although we're making steps towards understanding it. And that's the thing that living things have that we don't understand, and therefore it's quite hard to implement in an artificial form, because an engineer needs some idea of how it should be done before they can engineer it. So I'm cautious about this, and I put another word of caution in here. I think Gusz is absolutely right that evolutionary computing is extraordinarily powerful, but it's a model of what evolution does, and evolution produces all sorts of things. It also produces sickle cell anemia, for instance, which is thought to be a byproduct of a genetic adaptation to malaria, which works extremely well in areas where there's a lot of malaria, but as a consequence of that adaptation, a proportion of the population gets sickle cell anemia. It doesn't matter if more people survive the malaria than die of the sickle cell anemia. From an evolutionary point of view, it doesn't matter. It's a successful adaptation. So evolution is not the well, I would say in British terms, the Victorian ideal of ever onwards and upwards of progress. That's not how evolution works, okay? We can see it like that. Our artificial evolution systems have metrics to judge whether a design is better than the previous one, which we use to guide the process. We have to create those. They don't always pan out the way we expect either. So in a different learning system, trying to apply metrics, it just wanted to build a tower of blocks. Its metric was things are getting better if the bottom of the block is off the ground. That particular system learned to turn them over. The block bottom was now higher up, but it hadn't got anywhere near building a tower. That just happened to be a consequence of the metric not being very good. So these evolutionary processes are again models of what happens in actual evolution, and actual evolution is not progress. Indeed, it's argued that intelligence might have been quite accidental, our intelligence. Certainly not an ever onwards, upwards curve of progress.
Yes. Let me highlight this, what you started with, because this is an essential ethical thing, aspect of everything related to robot evolution. You said very correctly that using 3D printers as the tool for reproduction is not natural. That's not how nature works. And I completely agree, and I embrace this. I love this, because I don't want what nature does. If you look around how animals reproduce on Earth, you have all different solutions, like cell division, eggs, pregnancy. And what connects these seemingly very different systems, they are all distributed, without any central, infrastructure to it. So living beings can and do reproduce anywhere and everywhere. Introducing such a central unit as a 3D printer, or the robot fabricator, we call it in the ARE project, violates it somehow, but this is a good thing. So we do not need distributed reproduction, and based on ethical considerations, we do not want distributed reproduction. We want centralized reproduction, because then we have a kill switch. If we shut down the robot reproductor, the 3D printer, then reproduction will stop. And then there will be no baby robots anymore. So it doesn't mean that robots will drop down dead, which we may not want anyway, okay? But evolution will stop because reproduction will stop. So this is somehow the safety switch that I love to have. I do not want to unleash a robotic evolutionary system in the real world without being able to stop it. And this centralized unit for reproduction allows me to stop it if I want to.
So I'm going to challenge you here, Gusz. Yes? In what sense is reproduction not being used as a metaphor here in that case? I can point you at car factories, which are largely autonomous, don't need people to operate them. They do need materials to be delivered. They're like very large 3D printers, you might say, with lots of internal components. And cars come out the other end. Those aren't babies. These are not baby robots. These are automatically constructed robots. That, in my view, is not reproduction, it's production. It's automated production, which is fine. We know how to do that. We can automatically produce various things. In Australia, raw materials are being automatically produced by great big diggers, which churn around great big open cast mines without any human intervention, and chew up stuff and then drive off and deliver it into a hopper somewhere where it gets taken off for further use. So that kind of, but we don't call that reproduction.
With a good reason.
No, because it's not, and I'm not convinced that what you're describing is reproduction, although I am entirely convinced by your ethical point, because I agree that trying to produce reproduction in the biological sense is a rather dangerous undertaking. As I said, viruses are a case in point here.
So let me say that a biologist would tell us that reproduction is just a shorthand. Actually, it's not just reproduction, it's reproduction with heredity. Okay, so it is the offspring should inherit properties of the parents with some random variation. Nobody is the 50-50 mix of the parents, otherwise siblings would be the same. And there is always some mutation somewhere down the process. So I guess it was Dennett who said, if you have selection, reproduction, and heredity, then you have evolution. And the systems that I'm working on and several other labs, in Italy, in Norway, in the United States, in the UK, in Switzerland, and in Japan, they are trying to get systems that are reproductive and also have heredity. So what comes out is a random but partly determined result of existing things. And then the selection comes in. If you are better in whatever you are evaluated by, your chances to reproduce will be higher.
So, if I correctly understand, the point is that we are able to develop things that evolve, that grows up and merge the phenotype and the genotype and so on. But I think that the point that Ruth tries to say is that we are missing the autonomy in the reproduction, saying that we are able to reproduce the evolution of things, but right now something that is the 3D printer is the main element that doesn't allow the autonomy of this kind of reproduction in robotic system. And so this points out another important aspect of robots, that is the autonomy. Autonomy in the reproduction, autonomy in task performance, and so on. And I think it's another important point to touch in this discussion. What do you think about it? What do you think that are the missing technical points in order to make a robot autonomous, but not only in the reproduction point of view, also in the control point of view, in the task achievement, in the goal achievement point of view?
Well, autonomy is an unfinished task. Our current robots are not amazingly autonomous. As I said, normally quite power limited. Where they're not power limited, the complexity of the task they can carry out is rather limited. So robot vacuum cleaners are pretty autonomous, and they don't have to do very much, luckily. Robots that have to do more complex things are normally pretty hard to run entirely autonomously unless they're in a very well designed and pretty predictable environment. That's the problem we've had with cars. The environment in which cars operate is not sufficiently predictable to make them necessarily able to complete their task successfully, which is to say not actually killing anybody in the process. So there's a trade-off between the complexity of the task and the amount of autonomy you can give a robot, and also the risk element of what happens if it fails. Because most robots fail at some point. I mean, running over dog excrement is a failure because it's no longer cleaning, it's uncleaning, it's scattering mess everywhere. But that's an actual failure in the task. Luckily, that's not a major failure. Nobody dies. They just have to go around and clean up after it. With large, heavy robots on important tasks, failure is rather serious, as we see with cars. You know, failure has real-world consequences, and they can be quite serious ones. So the degree of autonomy that we allow into our environments is constrained by the complexity of the task and the consequences of failure. You should never assume that a robot will not fail. Nearly any robot you can name will fail at some point. Humans do too, okay? Things fail. So the mindset which says, we've got this wonderful machine and it's always going to work. Don't take that for granted, would be nearly any engineer's voice. Even an aircraft, which is a pretty reliable piece of kit, occasionally comes down, okay?
But if I understand well, this is, again, very related to the idea that the robot, the machine, has a precise goal, a task to achieve, a task to perform. What if, let's say, the task is not so well defined and there are several points during the life of the robot in which the robot somehow can choose what to do? This ability to choose is a form or is not a form of autonomy, and if it is it also a kind of responsibility? If one can choose, maybe there is a correct choice and a wrong choice. Can we say that a robot is doing the wrong choice?
So let me just return to the original question,
Yeah.
sorry. The autonomy. So one definition of autonomy is a robot is autonomous, or a machine is autonomous if it doesn't need a human to drive it. Okay, like the surgical robot is not a robot really, because it is just a very complicated scissor. And in the car industry, there are well-defined levels, or 5 levels of autonomy towards autonomous cars. It's always autonomy. Autonomy is not a black and white thing. It's a spectrum or a continuum, you know. So where you go up, and this is where I come back to your question, indeed. Yeah. So we could say the robot is autonomous and free, so free to determine on how to reach a goal, but not in selecting that goal. Okay. Drive me from here to my hotel or the airport. Okay, that's the goal. Okay, don't drive me to anywhere else. And how you drive me there, I don't care. So it has a lot of freedom, say, in that. And then we could elevate that. It could be also, you know, free in choosing. The car could choose: do I drive Ruth to the airport or do I drive Gusz to the airport? And lots of examples that could make increasingly more autonomous robot, in the sense that it will be more able to choose not only how it's doing something, but also what is it doing. Is it an answer?
Yeah.
Is it what you meant?
Yes, and I think then you've got to think carefully about the range of options that a robot can possibly have. So a robot with wheels cannot choose to go upstairs. It's not able to do that. Yeah? A robot that drives you to the airport probably cannot swim under the water and take you to an island offshore as well. Okay, so the engineering of a robot, it's like us, we can only do what we can do. I can't climb Everest, I'm not physically equipped to do that. Some humans are. I can't wake up tomorrow and say, I'm going to go and climb, well, it would have to be Mont Blanc from here, wouldn't it? I'm going to climb Mont Blanc. Yeah, that would be a foolish choice. I can't actually achieve it. I don't have the necessary physique to actually do that. So Gusz has made the essential point. Autonomy is a range of things, and one of the things that constrains the range is what you can actually do, and that's usually a very tight constraint with a robot, because the range of things a robot can do is usually not very wide, and that's one of the answers to your question. Okay. However, let me put it another way and take Gusz's ladder of autonomy. Okay. One thing we can do, and this is one of the real risks of robotics right now, is build autonomous weapons. Yeah, we can do that. It's because blowing people up is not that hard as robot tasks go. Yeah, it's really quite a simple task. I give you a drone, right, which flies around your city, Trieste, and at some very high level of autonomy, I've said, look for suspicious activity, and if you find someone carrying out suspicious activity, blow them up. That's a very high level of autonomy, because I haven't told you what suspicious activity is. I haven't constrained under what circumstances you blow people up. Like if they're in the middle of a crowd of people out in the main square, you're not just going to blow them up, okay? So the kind of choices that a robot can make are constrained in that sort of a way. The current level of autonomy in weaponry is something like, with a drone, you have to get a kill authorization before you're allowed to kill somebody. Autonomous weapons would remove the kill authorization. You would give it a list of targets, and if it found a target, it would be able to kill that target. Okay, that's very dangerous because we can do it. It's technically quite feasible. So the autonomy thing is concrete. Rather than asking a generic question like you did, I would say, what concretely are we saying here? Which choices? Under what circumstances, and what are the consequences of those choices? A planetary robot has choices, not many. It can choose to investigate a rock if it's passing it and it looks interesting. Okay, because if it gets choices wrong and kills itself, it's like millions of pounds to get another robot up there, so it doesn't have any choices. Okay, that's a choice though, but it's not what you call a serious choice. It can't really do anything other than decide to look at that rock or that rock. So let's be specific when we talk about things like this. What choices under what circumstances?
Yeah, that's the point, because we started, take the case of the vacuum cleaners. We started with hand, let's say, the one used by hands, okay, just a button, start the engine, stop the engine. In that case, it's a machine, not particularly autonomous. Okay, maybe the machine can choose to stop functioning. Now, after some tens of years, we have much more autonomous vacuum cleaners going around, and we do get angry with them when they fail and they go the way they shouldn't, okay? So somehow we attribute to them some, let's say, wrong choice made. You choose, you're choosing the wrong path in my house. So this is an example about how we are giving more and more space to choose to a machine, the same kind of machine, in a not very long time, I would say tens of years. We don't know exactly how will be the trend in the future, but very likely for vacuum cleaners we are going to make them more and more autonomous. Hopefully, let's say, also more and more precise in cleaning. At some point, it could be that this task that they are doing is much more complex than just the initial start the engine, stop the engine. And so, let's say, could be a choice that is the same kind of choice a person would have made in the past, and for which we can get angry and attribute some, let's say, responsibility. So it's true that we should talk about one specific choice if we want to decide now is the responsibility of the machine. But at some point, I suppose that machines will be doing complex choices. We don't know when, okay? You made a concrete example about weapons, automatic weapons, that are for sure a serious thing. But let's say, my point about responsibility was a premise for talking about also, let's say, freedom of choices, okay? If we start giving responsibility to a machine, maybe also we should start giving some right to the machines, okay? So if you can choose to do the wrong thing, maybe you can choose not to do a thing because you're tired or something like that. Is this something we should think about now, or is just let's say, a fantasy?
Well, I agree. The generic principle, okay, yeah, if you have more responsibilities, human rights. And you may or may not know, in the Netherlands, where I live, there is a party which is called the Party for Animals. And they come up for the right of animals. They have, I guess, I don't know, 3 to 5 seats in the parliament of 150 seats altogether. Okay, and there are apparently a lot of people who are, who agree to this. Animals should have rights. And machines could have the same support if only somehow we humans identify ourselves with them. And this is, I phrase it in a maybe more popular way. If you are young and you don't have enough money, you will have a crappy car. And it will break down and you will be angry with your car and you will kick it. And you will shout at it. And nobody takes offense. Okay? It's just a car. You are shouting to a machine that broke down. It's okay. But if it was a humanoid robot that breaks down and it doesn't do something the way you want it, and you are shouting at it and kicking it, do you feel it is somehow different? I don't know why, but maybe you have an idea why. Okay. It feels different. And there are all higher levels of that. If they're even animal-like, if they can reproduce, if they represent artificial life, whatever that is, okay, then there might be a point where we cross, and after that, switching it off is not switching it off, but it is killing. And I'm not sure where that point is, but that point could be here, and it's good to think of it.
I would argue this is metaphor. In other words, we're proposing a problem to ourselves on the basis of our imaginations here. And as I've said, our imagination is an active thing, and it's hard to stop people doing this because it is hardwired into us to imagine this kind of thing. Your washing machine makes choices. Most washing machines now have a degree of, you might say, AI in them. They can choose the temperature and various other settings according to the weight of the washing inside the machine, sometimes according to the material and how fast it dries and all the rest of it. By using the word choice here, we're giving it a human metaphor. It's not making choices, it's executing decisions on the basis of a program, okay? Every computer program makes choices. It's an if-then statement. If so-and-so, then do this. Are these choices? They're not choices in the human sense, because in the human sense, choice implies our human being behind it and the consequences. Now, that's not to say we can't project it into things. We can do that, and we do that. But it doesn't mean it's there, okay? We give animals rights because they're living things, and we attribute living things sentiment, suffering, a degree of cognition. We are, after all, ourselves animals. Yeah, they're the same kind of thing as we are, but not quite the same. Machines are not animals, they are engineered artifacts. Choice does not mean the same thing unless we project humanity into it. The fact that we do it doesn't make it true. Okay, now I know people do it. I don't know if you've ever come across the Seal robot. Very nice piece of, it's about that long, it's white and furry, and doesn't do very much. It wriggles when you stroke it, and it makes it all oof noises. It has big eyes with big eyelashes, and it's used with the elderly who are suffering from dementia in old people's homes to give them more interaction than they actually get, okay? You can show an elderly person the Seal robot, you can turn it over, unzip it, show them that it's a machine inside, and they will still treat it like an animal, as if it were alive. And if it breaks down, they'll be devastated, as if it's dead, because they feel an emotional bond with it. That's how humans work. It doesn't mean that the animal has rights, because it's not an animal, okay? It's a piece of machinery.
Okay.
I think that the main point of this discussion is that robots are results of engineering process in which all of us are involved as a scientist, and fortunately they are not able to do stuff for which they are not pre-programmed, or at least they can do something that is similar to what is programmed for. So I think that it could clarify a lot of stuff for the audience today, since a lot of people that are not involved, not engaged in the research, are worried about these robots, how can they impact in our lives. So, it could be a good point of view that should be shared to everyone in order to be relaxed about this topic and are happy to see the evolution of engineering process on this kind of devices, I think. I would like to thank you for your time and for the interesting discussion today, and all the audience to come here.
Yeah, now we have the Q&A
Yeah.
session, so if there are questions for the audience, we have our panelists and ourselves ready to answer. There are questions.
Thank you very much for the talk. It was really eye-opening. My question is a two-part one. The first one is for both of you. The second one is for Professor Aylett in particular. So many people nowadays are arguing against the efficacy of the Turing test to evaluate the intelligence of a machine, especially now in the age of large language models. So do you think that it can still apply, or do you think that there should be another metric for evaluating the intelligence of a machine? And the second question is, I've read some of Isaac Asimov's stories, and a recurring character is a robot psychologist. Do you think that in the future such a profession will exist, or is it just pure sci-fi? Thank you very much.
Okay, so I agree the Turing test is outdated. It measures something, but we don't know what. And intelligence is such a complex notion that it will take a lot of time to have another tool, instrument to measure it. Another question, Susan Calvin was the name, I guess. Yes, I guess we will have those experts. Whether they will be called robot psychologists, I'm not sure really, okay? But definitely there will be experts who are knowledgeable in robot behavior and anomaly of robot behavior and fixing those anomalies of robot behavior.
Yes, I agree with you, Gusz. The Turing test was of its time, and it relied on assumptions about what intelligence actually is that we wouldn't agree with necessarily now. I mean, do you think animals that can't talk are intelligent? Well, dogs are not intelligent then, they can't talk. We know other animals are intelligent. Crows are intelligent, they can't talk either. Yeah, we know other animals are intelligent, so it's a fairly outdated view of intelligence. So I would agree with this. And whether it's I don't think it's one thing either. Many people would say intelligence as a unitary concept is just a bad idea, and therefore trying to measure it as if it were is also a bad idea. Yes, in that case you have to think of a different paradigm, not just a different test. And as for the second question, well, I work in human-robot interaction, so of course all of us in that field, which is still a research field, worry about both the human side and the robot side and the interaction between them. So how do humans respond to robots? I've said a lot about that, haven't I? And how do robots behave in invoking that sort of human behaviour, and how should we design them? We already have it. We don't call it robot psychology because, I'm sorry, that's a metaphor. Okay.
Okay, we have other two questions at least. Three.
Hello. So I have to say that I really like your discussion because it speaks from more realistic perspective than what we hear usual these days, sort of from a hype of AI and robotics. But nevertheless, I would like to challenge your opinions that you presented. For example, about the difference in production and reproduction. You said that fundamentally robots are different from all living beings by one of the things is that they reproduce, they have like decentralized reproducing manufacturers. But it's not true, for example, for all species. For example, for ants, an ant colony has only one reproductive manufacturer, that's the ant queen. So, like, how far do you actually think it is? So, if we, how far do you think it is from connecting all the pieces such that the robots actually become sustainable by their own? I mean, of course, it's still not in our interest to connect all the parts. If we have a 3D printer, we need to bring plastic to it, we need to make a program to print something, and then it will do it. But how hard it is to, for example, have a vehicle which is also autonomous, which brings the oil to the plastic production, which is also 90% autonomous. Not many humans are working there, only organizing things. Already, many things there are automatically working. So what I want to say is, there is not so far, we are not so far away from making this production into a reproduction if we wanted to. Maybe not everybody wants to do it, but there might be some person, good or bad, I don't want to discuss that, who will connect this into an self-sustainable environment. Yes.
I didn't hear that question, so I'm not sure what to say for that. Let me point out one thing. Production in industry as we know it is always trying to make exactly the same thing over and over again, okay? It's identical clones of the same car, and if it's not identical to the previous one, then it's a mistake, and then we have to improve the production process. Reproduction as we know it from natural organisms, it benefits from variations. We don't want to have identical clones because that's not evolution. Evolutionary, that's boring. I know it doesn't answer your question, but it's partly because you didn't pose a question.
Yes, because I want to hear your comment, because I think that going from production to reproduction is not that far if we really wanted to do this. We are still occupied by making robots do some specific tasks really well. We put the purpose on the robot to do something really well, to clean the house really well. But maybe if we wanted to put the purpose on the robot to be self-sustainable, we don't have to work that far away. We don't have to work that much to accomplish that.
Well, I would tend to disagree with that. I think you're talking of a worldwide ant's nest, really. I come from a country which has just left Europe and erected trade barriers, okay? The just-in-time production lines of car factories have been completely screwed over by this political change. Okay, so if anything, we've now taken several giant steps away from automated production, which require just-in-time production by this whole network of companies all over the place. Okay, and that was only in the car industry. So the vision of a worldwide complete automation of manufacturing, where everything can be reproduced automatically, including from raw material extraction to things rolling out the door, I don't see that as inherently a very plausible idea, even if it were a desirable idea, because that's not how human society works, unfortunately. We are not ants' nests, and we are very varied. We have political variation, we have nation states and all sorts of other apparatus which prevents us from worldwide governments and worldwide automation and indeed worldwide anything. So no, that ain't going to happen.
So if the question was, how long will it take to go in that direction? Very likely the answer is we don't know, but consider the evolution took billions of years and did a lot of attempts. So if we are able to do one attempt, it's just one attempt. Okay, so it's a long thing, at least, if not, let's say, an unfeasible thing. We have still 5 minutes for the last two questions, I would say.
Hi, Ruth, when you mentioned the construction kind of and the materials that go into robots earlier and kind of used the words cogs and metal and gears, they're all, and even like robots of today typically kind of use plastic or kind of very rigid elements. Do you think in the future, and kind of following on from Gus's mimicking animals, that we'll see robotics incorporate more flexible or springy kind of elements that aren't necessarily just so kind of, when you think of robots, so rigid and so structured, but allow it to maybe mimic kind of, I don't know, like a grasshopper that can kind of use the springiness of its legs to complete a task? And I think maybe in an application such as like search and rescue, where humans or typical animals might find it hard to do the task, it can kind of use different materials from what we're typically kind of working with and thinking about.
Well, Gusz probably can say something about this, I think.
Definitely, soft robotics is a hot area.
Exactly.
And soft robotics really has a huge potential of realizing completely new forms of actuation and sensing. Okay, so that's really hot. There is a journal about soft robotics, and that really has also for evolutionary robotics a great potential, because good old engineering, okay, that can build a tank or a BMW or a drone, doesn't work with soft materials. We just don't have the maths, we just don't have the engineering books. And on those cases, evolution is your friend to design.
Yes, I think you need evolution with soft robotics. The problem with soft robotics from an engineering point of view is tied up with what are called degrees of freedom. And it's an engineering term which means something you can control, like a control element, like going forwards or turning round would be control elements. So most robots have a limited number of them. Even a human face, you know, 44 muscle groups on your face, 44 degrees of freedom, basically. Soft robotics has an almost infinite number of degrees of freedom, so they're very hard to control. It's one of their major constraints. And I think Gusz is absolutely right. Without evolutionary computation, it's going to be very hard to control them. So that the two are really quite tightly bound together.
Okay, I would say last question.
You posed a really big difference between choices, what the human choices, and robots and computer program choices, stating that choices of robots are just the result of computations, of informatic computation that at the end of the day are just if-then statements. But aren't our choices also the result of chemical reactions inside our brain that at the end of the day are also deterministic and if-then statements and choices that are of course prompted by our experience, that still prompts acts as an input for all of these chemical reactions in our brain that are deterministic and are, if I have this input, if this happens, this other thing will happen and I will do.
This is a big question for 2 minutes answer.
Oh, okay. We're not that kind of organism. I mean, that's a mechanical view of humans. It's another metaphor, actually. It is a metaphor. Children are socialised, culture exists, our choices are circumscribed by society and by norms, as well as by our own individual decisions. So human choice is a very complex issue, and it's not just an electric synapse, although that may be how it's executed eventually. So no, I don't agree that you can render humans down into an if-then statement with a lot of branches.
Okay, I think we have done with our one very brief question. Yeah, I'm looking at that clock.
When we talk about the autonomous point of view, I feel like we are always forgetting in some sense the fact that we want our ecosystem of robots to work autonomously, whatever, but the purpose behind it at the current point, like evolutionary point of view or artificial intelligence point of view, we always introduce like metrics to actually decide how good something is performed, and we never actually provide any possibility to the robot to actually behave by itself, because we have not found a way to actually code that. Do you think that the current approaches we are using might at some point introduce that purpose that like simple life does not have in some sense, while biological one has?
Yes.
We should change completely our paradigm.
No. I think it depends on the purpose of the researcher. I always say that evolution is used as an optimizer, okay? But it's about adaptation, not about optimization. And there are systems, computer-simulated robot evolution systems, without a clear goal. So there is no task performance that determines whether a robot can reproduce and survive. It's all about reproduction and survival based on environmental conditions and luck. There is even a hardware implementation done in the Restore Robotics lab, which is a beautiful paper from Alan Winfield. So those systems exist, but they are not useful. So that research is very hard to get funded.
Yeah, that's a point. So if you have money. Okay, thank you very much. I think this is our last question. So I thank again our guests. I thank Erica for the training.